Hello again, it's the Big Heavy, and today we are talking about home office design. Now, for quite a few of us, working from home has become a more accessible and prevalent option, and at least in my case, it's very much changed the way that I work, that I, to some extent live, and how we use our house, and in particular, how I use my home office. I'm, much luckier than the average bear, which I will, gladly acknowledge, in that I have essentially two home-based workspaces. One of them I'm sitting in right now, and you've probably seen my video on the home office setup for people with a real job, which is just over to my right here. And I also have a home office set up within the house. And I'm converting this area into more of a YouTube workspace and photography, movie room, things like that, and kind of moving back into the home office in the house. Now being able to move back into a space that's a dedicated home office that was kind of set up for the purpose, and was sort of my on and off home office before I started working from home essentially full time about 2 years ago. So prior to the job I'm in now, pre-COVID, I would probably spend 85–90% of my work time out on the road, going to client sites, traveling around, doing pitches, helping run teams, all that sort of thing, and spend half of Friday in my home office, and the other half would be going to doctor's appointments, running errands, all the stuff you kind of have to do on that one weekday you're home if you're traveling a lot. Like most of you, COVID changed that. I was suddenly home all the time. And post-COVID, once I switched jobs, it became fairly clear that I would be home probably 85-ish% of the time, and then spending the other 5 to 15% of the time on the road. And that got me thinking about redesigning my office, since there were several things that I didn't like about my old home office setup. Most of the furniture had migrated from our previous home. Most of it was stuff I had gotten 15, 20 years ago when my design aesthetic was a little bit different. I think in most cases I sort of bought a collection of functional things and jammed them together into one space, versus for this home office remodel, what I tried to do is really think about what did I want in terms of an office, in terms of design, and in terms of what I want to get done and how everything would fit together. So I tried to take more of a systems and design-oriented approach to this office redesign effort versus hey, I need a desk, let me go buy a cool desk. Hey, I need a printer, let me go buy the best printer. And that's the approach I want to share with you today and kind of talk you through, in the hopes that it helps you with any home office redesign efforts that you're thinking through. Whether you've kind of just recently realized that, hey, I'm going to be home full time, or you've been working from home for quite a bit and you've kind of decided that whatever setup you have isn't quite working and you want to modify and update that setup. You will see little bits and pieces of my newly redesigned and still not yet complete home office. I'll put a link down below in the show notes to the video of my full home office walkthrough once that's ready. But in the meantime, you can consider this a little bit of an early preview. Now, as I mentioned, I tried to design this office from a systems thinking or design thinking, whatever you want to call it, approach. And that might sound like a little bit of hippy-dippy baloney.
What a bunch of hippy-dippy baloney.
But in my professional life, I've had the opportunity to employ design-oriented techniques to business problems and found it to be pretty effective because it focuses on the human beings and how they interact in an environment or interact with each other, versus kind of sitting down and coming up with a list of features and functions and then going and trying to check off all the boxes on that list, which is what I typically do before I kind of got into the whole design thinking type of approach. Now, when you're applying this to your own home office, before you go out and start looking at desks or trying to find out if you want a standing desk or a sitting desk or whatever, what I would suggest is starting by keeping a log of how you use your office. And if your office is the kitchen table or some little tiny corner of your apartment and you just got a raise and are moving into an 8,000 square foot house and going to design this megaplex for your office, whatever your situation is, you don't have to be in your ultimate final space, but you can start by thinking through and logging, what do I do in my office on a daily basis? And I would make this as extensive as, getting out a notepad, using a digital tool, whatever your preference is, and kind of writing down what you did for each block of 15-minute time. If you really want to get sort of persnickety about it, set a 15-minute timer on your watch, and every 15 minutes write down, hey, I'm checking emails right now sitting at my desk. Or, hey, I'm walking around pacing because I just was on 4 hours of video calls and I'm going bonkers. Hey, I'm sitting here reading a book and my chair is really uncomfortable. So, kind of note down, what you're doing, what you're feeling, why you're doing it, and just kind of get that data. And I would try and do that for at least 1 week. And the reason I would say try and do it for at least 1 week is, at least in my case, I'll have different flows to each day. Something like a Monday morning, usually I kind of get into my office nice and early. I sit down and do some planning. I kind of think through, what am I doing this week, look at my appointments, all that stuff. And it's a different flow than, say, like a Friday morning where it's, hey, I have 10 things I need to get done. I'm trying to squeeze in all those last minute calls, and ideally trying to get all my stuff, sort of off the docket by 3 p.m. so I can leave my home office and go goof off somewhere and do something fun. Now, as you do this, think of yourself like an anthropologist. Think of yourself like Jane Goodall, or whoever that's kind of sitting in the jungle with your clipboard, and you're watching some tribe or creature or some entity outside yourself, and you're noting down, the gorilla is now eating a banana, the gorilla is picking his nose. Don't provide any value judgments as you start to keep this log of all the activities you're doing, and don't try and categorize or bucket anything yet. If you find yourself during one of those 15-minute intervals goofing off and browsing the web, write down, hey, goofing off and browsing the web. Don't, say, hey, I'm wasting time, or don't provide any kind of value judgment. Your goal is to ultimately figure out how you actually use your space, the key activities you do, and to the extent you can log some feelings of frustration, of happiness, of whatever, put those in too. If you're sitting there kind of doing a call and your chair is really uncomfortable, write down, hey, been on an hour call, chair's really uncomfortable. In my case, I had a sort of old school executive looking desk, because 20 years ago when I bought my furniture, executives had big, heavy wood type furniture, and it was ultimately a little too low for my legs, so my legs would rub against the thing, and it was super annoying, and I just sort of dealt with it. But then when I was doing this logging exercise, I was like, hey, bumped my massive quads into my desk again. This is stupid. So once you've got that log of the things you do in your office, and again, ideally for a week, maybe if you can do it for 2 weeks, and during that second week you could just sort of validate what you're doing instead of doing that 15-minute interval exercise if that gets a little bit tedious for you. Sit down and look for kind of the key themes and activities that you do in your office. These would be things like, in my case, I spend a fair amount of time on video calls. So I had this theme around just sitting there talking to my screen. And part of that was, I would get distracted and go open a browser, do something like that. I would get uncomfortable with that, kind of annoying desk that was bumping against me. My chair maybe wasn't as comfortable as it could be. So, that was a segment of activities with some, descriptive text around it. Another thing that I would do on a fairly routine basis is I'd deal with, all our kind of household finances. Like most humans, I get a whole pile of mail, 87% of which is garbage. But you got to open all this stuff, you got to sort through it. There's a pile of stuff to shred, there's a pile of stuff to keep or scan or something like that. There's a pile of stuff I need to react to. There's some stuff I can react to that instant. There's some stuff that I need to do a whole bunch of thinking or noodling or processing on that I'm going to react to later. So I had this whole activity around kind of mail processing, home finance, being able to have a space where I could sort out stuff and kind of disposition it, and then put some of that stuff away for later processing, and have some of that stuff just ready to go straight into the bin. And as you start to narrow down those activities, think, if you've ever done kitchen design, there's this whole idea in kitchens, both commercial and home, of stations. You have your hand washing station, obviously, which is kind of your sink. You have a prep area where you go and chop vegetables and that sort of thing. You have your cooking area with your range. You might have some sort of pot and pan storage. And a well-designed kitchen, and a lot of stuff that goes into the thinking around commercial kitchens, is minimizing your movements between all those. So you want to group logical tasks together. My prep station I probably want close to my hand wash station because I want to clean my hands and then go chop a bunch of stuff. Maybe I want my pots and pans near my range because I'm going to be pulling frying pans off the wall and frying stuff versus having to walk all the way across the room. And you can take your activities and start to think through, what kind of stations do I want in my office? And there's not going to be hundreds of them, there might be a couple or three. And in my case, I had, a desk/video call type station, which to some extent is obvious, but we'll talk a little bit more about some of the parameters around that station. I had this kind of mail processing and project station. And my idea was I need this place where I can go and take this big stack of stuff, kind of lay it all out in front of me, be able to look at it, disposition it, and then I need a place where I could kind of store all that stuff that was in some intermediate stage. I also had this idea of a project station where, I'm tinkering with various little things. I might be building something, or I might be trying to assemble a bunch of stuff for, a work project, and that stuff might be printouts, it might be, magazine articles or whatever. So I had this idea that I wanted a place where I could, be able to look at a project. That might be a storyboard, it might be, slides that I want to physically move around versus moving around on a screen. And then being able to, leave that over the course of a couple or 3 days when I kind of leave that work and go think about something else, but being able to come back to it. And also being able to take that kind of work in process, store it somewhere for easy retrieval later. So, I had this idea of, my desk, video call station, my mail processing station, kind of a project station, and then I had sort of a reading and meditating station. So I like to try and meditate every morning for 15 minutes or so. I like having a comfortable chair that I can sit and read in, whether I'm reading the news on my iPad or reading some long work PowerPoint document or something. I find just being able to move a few feet, sit in a different chair is a nice way to kind of make that activity a little more effective. From a practical perspective, I also like having another chair in my office. So, one of the kids can come in, my wife can come in, they can sit down in this nice and attractive and comfortable spot. I can kind of sit in my desk chair and we can have a nice chat. So that was kind of my meditating / reading / chatting with somebody who I like chatting with sort of station. I also worked on different little concepts for, kind of places, I guess. What kind of stuff do I need to store? How often am I going to access that kind of stuff? Where do I want to put pictures? That is an area where I will see them and then they make me happy. Where can I put kids' artwork and, again, have it somewhere where I can see it and where it will make me happy. And then where do I put stuff that, I kind of need but don't need close at hand? So, things like a lot of the YouTube video gear that I have and other items that, I don't want kind of in my visual range and sort of distracting and cluttering up my life. So now that we know our activities, we kind of know the stations we want, we can start to think about how and where to arrange those. And the concept I would suggest that you use to think through some of that stuff is this idea of first order retrievability. And that at a basic level is you want the stuff that you use the most to be closest at hand. So to start with that, think through where you're going to spend most of your time when you're in your home office. For 90-ish% of the population, myself included, that's sitting at my desk. So I thought about, what kind of stuff do I need close at hand when I'm sitting at my desk? And in my case, and your case may be different, so please don't just blindly do what I did. I really didn't need that much stuff at my desk. It was mostly around interacting with the computer, so I needed my keyboard, I needed my mouse, obviously, but I didn't need a ton of drawer space. I didn't need 500 pencils and pens around. I needed maybe 1 or 2 pens. I needed some form of place to keep Post-its or something, some sort of little rapid note-taking place. But I ultimately wanted, a nice big space where I could stretch out, where I could move my mouse and keyboard over if I needed to write something, or, I was looking through a physical document or something like that. And ultimately that got me from, my previous desk, which had a whole bunch of drawer space, had kind of drawers everywhere with little organizers and whatnot, to going with just a standing desk. I don't have a ton of storage space because frankly, I don't need a ton of storage space. And that, nice, clean, big, empty space where I could use my computer, be able to move the computer stuff away and kind of stretch out and have this initial workspace in front of me for when I wanted to process mail or work on a little project. And also having that ability to flip it into standing mode. So when I was on those video calls, getting antsy, feeling like I needed to move around a little bit, I had that capability at my fingertips. That concept also drove how I thought about storage. I wanted some enclosed storage for a lot of that stuff that used to kind of live out in the open. I decided that I ultimately needed less space to keep books. I tried to winnow down my book collection since, like a lot of people, I had a whole bunch of books in my office that I never really looked at. I probably regularly look at a physical thesaurus still, since I find it's a lot better than the online ones. I have a couple or other 3 reference books that I look at occasionally, and then I have 1 or 2 books that I like to consult every now and then. But I tried to get rid of all the books that I never cracked, all those books that people put in their office so other people see them and think they're super smart. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, so book storage kind of got written off the list for me. Now I'd contrast this idea of first order retrievability with how I used to typically organize things, and that was, you sort of put all the like stuff together. You put all your pens and pencils in one place, and then you'd have like your office supply drawer and put all those things in one place. And to some extent, I have this little, IKEA Alex cabinet in the corner where I have pens, pencils, office supplies, and all that junk. But it's the farthest away from where I typically position myself. So again, going back to that concept of first order retrievability, it's stuff I don't use often, so it's the farthest away from where I physically sit. The stuff I use most often is a pen, a Post-it, the computer stuff. That's all right in my physical reach space. And I'll talk a little bit more about storage when I do the office unveil, but I did a lot of 3D printing and printed little bins that were the right size for the things I wanted to put in them. And ultimately, after setting up my office, I kind of validated my first order retrievability by just putting stuff in the drawer where I thought it made the most sense, and going through about a month of using the office and moving stuff around. So I might have something that I'd have to get up and grab from another drawer, and if I was doing that 3 or 4 times, I would move that thing from that drawer to somewhere where I could grab it while sitting at my desk if that's where I used it most. And I'd also look and say, hey, this thing I thought I'd use a lot, I'm really not using, so let me take it out of this drawer that's close at hand and kind of that first order high value real estate, and I'm going to move it away to sort of secondary or tertiary storage, so it's kind of out of my space. So now it's time for what I think is kind of the fun piece. So you've defined how you're going to use your office, you've kind of defined these key activities you're going to do, you've thought about these stations and how they fit together and at least approximately where they are. And the next step that I would recommend you follow is thinking through some design principles for your space. So what separates the offices that are on these sort of office porn type videos on YouTube, like the one that I will upload and link to down below, from my previous office, which was again just sort of a conglomeration of functional stuff, is usually there's an overall thoughtful design aesthetic. And sometimes you can take it too far. I personally don't believe in the offices where you have 17 mechanical keyboards. I'm not sure why people do that. I don't necessarily believe in having LED accent light everywhere and all that stuff. But I did want to actually have a space that had some thoughtful design put into it. And by that I mean, I thought through, what do I want out of this office? What do I want to feel when I walk in here at 6 a.m. on Monday and I'm getting ready to start? And so, I used my old office for a few weeks with that in mind, and started writing down little things I noticed that I either didn't like or did like. I did like things like I talked about that little reading space in the corner where someone who I liked could come in and I could have a nice chat with them. I didn't like that the office was relatively dark. I didn't like that I walked in and I saw a lot of clutter and a lot of things sort of in my visual range. So I started coming up with some design principles and some ideas for the aesthetic that I wanted in my office. So I wanted it to be bright, I wanted it to be clutter-free, I wanted all the stuff that I didn't use regularly to be sort of out of that visual range. And I wanted that kind of minimalist, mid-century modern, I don't know what exactly the architectural term is for it, but I started getting honed in on a certain aesthetic that I wanted. And I'm not a designer by trade. I'm one of those people that will typically put on some outfit that I think is super awesome and well coordinated, and my wife will say, you're gonna leave the house wearing that. So I'm not the person to provide you with design advice, but the cheat code that I used was, I'd go on Houzz, I'd go on Google Images, I'd go even in some of the highfalutin architectural magazines like Architectural Digest or Southern Living or whatever tickles your fancy. And I'd look at stuff and say, oh, this is a thing I like. You can go, when you do an image search on most of the search engines, click on something and it'll show you, more like this. So you can start to hone in on the aesthetic that you like, and you can start to find kind of the key lingo around that. I mentioned I started seeing a lot of things I liked, and I would find out, oh, that's mid-century modern. Who knew? And I would use that to kind of search for color palettes, to search for ideas and concepts that I like. And ultimately what I started doing, which is, again, something that I've stolen from the design world, is creating a little bit of a mood board is the technical term. I would think of this as a things I like repository. And for me, that was just pasting images from the web that I liked and kind of putting that into a digital notebook. This is not a particularly complex exercise. Again, you're not working for a client other than yourself, so you don't have to justify it to anyone. And I would at least start by just anything you see where you're like, oh, that tickles my fancy. Don't know why, don't know what it is, don't know if I like the desk or the paneling on the wall or what the heck it is, but put that image in your little things you like notebook. And once you have a dozen or so images, go through and you'll start to see some themes. In my case, it was things like, I wanted an accent wall. I wanted to emphasize natural materials. I didn't want a lot of bright colors. I wanted sort of a, neutral palette with some, earth tones. I wanted a lot of wood. And I started kind of getting to, here's my list of design principles that I want. And they can also be kind of guiding principles. For me, one of the guiding principles was I'm in a position in my life where, I have a little bit of dough finally. It's not due to YouTube, so don't get too excited if you're thinking of starting a YouTube channel. I ultimately wanted to buy things that were made in the US where possible, or, made in kind of a craftsperson type environment. I did use one IKEA component, so I wasn't able to fully live my dream of, buying well-crafted stuff. But, I had this idea of buying, well-made furniture. I ultimately got my chair from a furniture company in North Carolina. I got my desk from a company in Michigan. I got my shelving from a company in the UK. So I was able to kind of meet that mission. And even though it's not something that you can see or touch or feel, it is, I think it does come across in kind of the quality of some of the components, and it's hopefully going to be stuff that lasts me for much longer than it would if I just bought the typical, generic press board sort of mass manufacturer stuff. That's not to say that you can't have an office that looks awesome, that looks beautiful, that has a great design aesthetic without spending a pile of money. I was kind of surprised, and I did a little bit of this, in how much, vintage solid wood furniture is out there and things like Facebook Marketplace. I got a little side table from, the 60s from some company that I think was in Virginia that's solid wood. There's tons of stuff out there at garage sales and whatnot that's solid wood. If you do go the IKEA route or the overstock.com type route, there is still stuff out there that looks nice, that's presumably fairly well made. And I don't mean to imply that, only people in the US can build stuff that's, well made and is ultimately kind of a craft versus just a thing. I'm sure there's plenty of people in whatever other country that are craftspeople as well. Just getting access to those products from where I sit was a little bit more challenging. So now you kind of have all the ingredients you need to start actually figuring out the stuff you're going to put in your office. And I would suggest, as you start to think through the actual pieces of furniture and the components that you're going to use to assemble your office, do a little bit of a layout so you can get a sense of how things will fit together. And if you want to get your nerd on, or if you have some sort of, architectural or design skills, or want to acquire those skills, there's software out there. I used a product called Home Designer to try and do an initial layout. It ultimately didn't work as well as I had hoped it would. So in the end, I ultimately just ended up going with kind of graph paper. But if you want to be an interior designer or something, Revit is, I guess, the standard that a lot of my colleagues in that industry use. So you can go and try and learn that software and make this a little bit of a learning endeavor as well. Or if you're crafty, you can go and do what I used to do in elementary school and go and get some foam core, build yourself a little model of the room. And your goal here is not to get exact scale replica, unless you're into that sort of thing, but to see how things fit together and get a sense of space. You might end up thinking that, hey, this piece of furniture that I saw online is super awesome, but when you take a little rectangle that's the size of the furniture and put it on your little graph paper floor plan, it might be too big, or it might bump into something, or it might not quite fit the space in the way you envisioned it. So to the extent you use one of those tools, either the super high-tech version or the low-tech graph paper version, try and just validate that you've selected things that will fit together from a size perspective, that the placement kind of makes sense. Once you've got everything laid out, take an imaginary version of yourself and kind of walk through there and be like, hey, I like to pace a lot when I'm on a video call. Do I have enough room to pace? Hey, I want to have this storage area over here. Can I open the drawers, or is that going to bump into my desk? So think through some of those considerations and make sure everything kind of is the size that you think it is, and the relationship between all those components works, and you don't end up with some massive credenza and some tiny desk that looks goofy. You can even, when you get an idea of the size of the components you're going to use, take whatever carpet you have in your room out, or if your office is carpeted, this should work as well, and take some painter's tape, and you can just kind of line out, here's where I'm going to put this piece, it's going to be about this big, here's where I'm going to put my desk, make sure everything fits. You can kind of walk through and make sure it's laid out the way you like, and that the station concept that you've developed makes sense and ultimately works together with each of the individual components. The other exercise I did that I think was pretty valuable, and ultimately I guess was sort of necessary since I was selling most of the furniture that I had, was I took everything out of my drawers. I emptied every single drawer, every single cabinet, every single shelf, and kind of put everything out and I did a pretty big cull. I tried to go through and get rid of stuff. There's a whole science to organizing. You can do that thing where you ask if the thing gives you joy or whatever. My benchmark is generally, have I used this thing in the last 6 months? If no, then have I used it in the last 18 months? If no, put it in the trash. If it's something that has some sentimental value or something like that, what am I going to do with it? Is there some way I can kind of capture that sentimentality and then get it out of my life if it's big, bulky, or annoying? But I ultimately tried to trim down all my stuff and tried to arrange it for at least an initial cut of that first order retrievability. That also emptied out all my furniture, which I ultimately end up selling most of on Facebook Marketplace. Things, had some interesting values. An old recliner I had that I didn't think was worth all that much got snapped up like instantly. And then my fairly elaborate wood furniture set, took forever to sell and, it's frankly sold for less than what I'd hoped it would go for. But, selling it was ultimately the best option that was available to me. With everything cleared out of your office, you can make any modifications that you want to do. In my case, one of the complaints that I found doing that little office sort of anthropology exercise was that I didn't have enough light in the office. I put in this track lighting system early on to try and address some of that, but it looked a little goofy. It wasn't great, and whenever you looked up, you kind of had these track lights blazing into your eyes. So I decided I wanted to put cans in the ceiling. There's a whole bunch of good videos out there on retrofitting cans. It's probably a lot easier than you think it is, and I shouldn't even use the term can, since now they just have these little wafer lights that are kind of little pucks and are very easy to install. You don't have to goof around with putting an actual can in the ceiling. I think they look much cooler since they don't have the little screw-in bulb anymore. I also decided that I wanted some in-ceiling sound. I put speakers in other rooms, so that was, again, relatively old hat for me. I added a couple of speakers into the ceiling, and I upgraded my ceiling fan. I wanted something that was a little bit more modern, a little less bulky, and also something that I could automate and control through my home automation system. So with all the furniture out of there, I had some room to work, and I was able to kind of lay out my lighting and speaker layout. Was able to cut all the holes. I did have to drill some extra holes to run some wire between joists. Again, this is all stuff you can look up on other videos. I won't give you the whole lowdown on how to do that, but it's pretty straightforward home improvement type of work if you're into that kind of thing. Once I got all that done, patched up the additional holes I'd put in the drywall, did the painting. I generally hate painting, but decided to do it myself, and it was a little bit less painful than I remembered painting being, so that was pretty good. And during the course of all that, I started ordering all the new furniture pieces. Most of the stuff I ordered required some level of manufacture or shipping from some faraway place, so pretty much everything had a 4 or 5 week lead time. So do plan, if you're going to do this elaborate home office remodel, where are you going to work in the meantime? In my case, it was a combination of the kitchen table and coming out here to this office, but for you that might be a little bit more of a challenge depending on what kind of space you have. So hopefully you get a few nuggets out of this that help you with your own home office redesign. And do hit the subscribe button, because I will publish that video that gives a little bit of a tour and adds my own home office to the litany of office porn that's out there floating around in the ether. Hopefully is a little bit unique in the sense that it's actually designed to be used by somebody that has what I like to think of as a professional career versus designed as some sort of media showcase or whatnot. And also, as always, I answer pretty much any comment that is reasonable and rational down in the comments. So if you have some good ideas on office redesign, if you've done something cool, if you have a question on the process that I went through, throw that down there. I'll help you out to the extent I can. I will also wish you the best of working wherever it may take you, whether that's home or abroad. Big Heavy, saying peace. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.